talking about the budget deficit, the national debt, and America's future. Topics that are hard to escape if you listen to the news on a daily basis. There would be few in this country who would dispute the assertion that the question of how America is going to handle its current budget deficit and national debt is going to be central to next November's presidential election. In this paper, I hope to provide a basic understanding of the concepts of the deficit and the debt. It can be a little bit more confusing than you might think, and to offer some competing visions of America's future that depend on the choices that it makes about how to handle these seemingly intractable issues. I confess that my own personal attitude on this subject has gone through a transformation over time. I recall that nearly 30 years ago, I wrote an indignant letter to the Wall Street Journal complaining about the shocking size of the budget deficits being run by the Reagan administration. Reagan having criticized the Carter administration for running deficits that turned out to be tame in comparison. I was a deficit hawk. But as the years passed, and many of the dire predictions about large deficits failed to come to pass, I changed my tune, arguing that how the country chooses to finance its spending, whether by taxation or by borrowing, and borrowing is just taxes postponed into the future, didn't really matter. All that mattered was what the government chose to do with the resources that it took from the private sector. If the resources are well and wisely spent, then you shouldn't care whether they were acquired by current taxes or future taxes. But if the resources are wasted, then you should be indignant about that waste, again, regardless of how those resources were acquired. I still believe that, except that I guess I lacked imagination. I never thought the government could borrow so much, so fast, and in my opinion, waste so much of it, that we would be entering uncharted territory when it comes to both the size of the budget deficit and the size of the national debt. We are now much closer to a point of no return, abandon hope, all ye who enter here scenario than I ever thought possible. So, budget deficits, a primer. When we talk about budget deficits or surpluses, we're talking about the difference between the government's revenues from taxes, fines, and other sources, and its spending on goods and services, as well as on transfer payments. If revenues exceed spending, then the government is running a budget surplus, while if spending exceeds revenues, then there is a budget deficit. A balanced budget is when spending just equals revenues. The budget deficit or surplus is a flow variable, meaning that one must state a specific time period over which it is measured, a month or a quarter, or most commonly for budget deficits, the yearly or annual budget deficit. A government that wants to spend money has to find a way to get the money, and at the broadest level there are three sources. The government can raise taxes or fees in order to finance spending. The government can borrow from the rest of the economy by selling securities in the U.S. Treasury bills, Treasury notes, and Treasury bonds. Or three, the government can simply create, literally print, more money, as did Germany under the Weimar Republic in the early 1920s, and as did Zimbabwe in the late 2000s. That latter option is not open to such nations such as the United States that have independent central banks that are in charge of monetary policy. In this country, the Federal Reserve System, the Fed for short, is prohibited by law from purchasing debt directly from the Treasury. It can only participate in the process once removed, by buying government securities that have first been sold to the general public. That doesn't mean that inflation is impossible, it simply means that the Treasury can't do it all by itself. But if the Fed is committed to keeping the interest rate on government bonds at a low level in order to make it easier for the government to borrow, as it was during World War II and up through March 1951, at which point the Fed and the Treasury reached what's called the famous Fed-Treasury Accord, then inflation can easily result from government borrowing because the central bank is no longer independent. It's committed to keeping the interest rate low, and when the government borrows, it must buy up the debt, which tends to increase the money supply and cause inflation. There's a fundamentally important lesson here. When the government finances its spending by taxation or by borrowing, it is not inflationary, because in either case there is an automatic offset to increase government spending. Both higher taxes and borrowing reduce the funds available to be spent in the private sector dollar for dollar, with the increase in public sector spending leaving the net demand for goods unchanged. Inflation can only arise if the government spending is paid for by money creation, because in that case there's no corresponding decrease in private sector demand, leading to a net increase in aggregate demand and thus rising prices. Conclusion. Budget deficits are inflationary only to the extent that they cause a change in monetary policy as well as fiscal policy. Philosophically, there was a very strong economic and political bias against budget deficits up through the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt was no Keynesian, at least before he became president. In 1932, he ran on a platform that promised to get rid of the budget deficits that were being run by the Hoover administration by raising taxes and cutting spending. It was only after a group of economists translated John Maynard Keynes' general theory of employment, interest, and money into more easily understood language, and Paul Samuelson brought Keynesian macroeconomics to generations of college students with his groundbreaking 1948 textbook. You can actually buy a version of that original first edition on Amazon for a little bit over $65 if you're interested in what the first true Keynesian macroeconomics textbook actually looked like. And that Keynesian, it was only then that the Keynesian approach to macroeconomics really took off, and budget deficits, at least during recessions, went from being a vice to being a virtue. In a modern economy that relies on sales and income taxes, and that has welfare programs that are means tested, the emergence of a recession will automatically cause the government's budget to go into deficit. These are what economists call the automatic stabilizers, because tax revenue will fall and spending on unemployment insurance and other income supplement programs will rise. Even better, the government could deliberately choose to raise spending and or cut taxes during recession, policies that would boost demand but would also worsen the budget deficit. It was actually the Kennedy-Johnson tax cuts of 1964 that were the first example of such an approach. The U.S. economy was in a recession in 1960-61 and growing slowly after that. Kennedy's Keynesian-oriented Council of Economic Advisors recommended a tax cut to stimulate the economy. And though it did not become law until 1964, by which time the economy was already in a recovery, it is credited with setting the stage for strong economic growth for the next 5 years. Marginal tax rates were cut across the board, with top rates falling from a very punitive 91% tax rate down to 71%. While there were certainly demand-side effects of those tax cuts, supply-siders, in retrospect, have touted the beneficial effects of lower tax rates on the economy, downplaying the effects on aggregate demand. While budget deficits to combat recessions became acceptable and even desirable, there is nothing in Keynesian economics to suggest that deficits should continue year in and year out. Since post-war expansions have been longer and stronger than recessions, budget surpluses during economic expansions should more than offset the recessionary deficits, resulting in no need for an increase in the national debt due to counter-cyclical deficit spending. It's only been since the late 1970s that the annual budget deficits have become the rule rather than the exception. And only in the past few years the deficits have reached levels hardly even imagined in the past, $1.5 trillion a year for the last few years. Though I have added in quite a few embellishments to the story thus far, the basic definition of a budget deficit seems straightforward. Spending exceeds revenues. But there is one huge complication. Congress has specified that some programs, most notably Social Security, are to be treated separately from the rest of the government budget. But for the purpose of measuring the overall effect of federal spending and taxes on the economy, the government reports what is called a unified budget that consolidates Social Security with the rest of the government's activities. So what, you might well ask? Well, at least until recently, the Social Security system has been taking in more revenues than it has been paying out in benefits, with the difference accumulating in the so-called Social Security Trust Fund. By law, those excess revenues have been used to purchase special U.S. Treasury securities. Because the surplus generated by Social Security has been consolidated with the deficit generated by the general budget, the net effect has been to make the overall budget deficit look smaller than it actually is. Translation, you think the government budget deficit was way too big? It's even bigger than you think it was. Side note, that particular piece of accounting chicanery is likely to soon disappear, because as the Social Security system begins to run a deficit, that will make the unified budget look even worse rather than better. And at that point, the politicians will simply tell us that a unified budget doesn't make sense anymore, because they can't use it to hide the true size of the deficits that they've actually been running. National debt, a primer. The national debt is simply the accumulation of past budget deficits and surpluses. In contrast to a budget deficit, it is a stock variable, meaning that it has to be measured at a particular point in time, December 31st, 2010, for example. Whenever the government runs a budget deficit, the national debt grows, and whenever it runs a surplus, it shrinks. The national debt was actually paid off under President Andrew Jackson. Revenues from the sale of public lands and tariffs far exceeded the level of government spending, and the surplus actually eliminated the national debt, if only briefly. Of course, Andrew Jackson, the founder of the Democratic Party, was a true Jeffersonian at heart and vetoed a bill that promised spending millions of dollars on internal improvements, what we would today call infrastructure projects. Simple enough, but there's also a complication associated with thinking about the debt, just as there was with the deficit. And the first is directly related to the complication noted above about the deficit. The U.S. gross debt includes two parts. First, the debt held by the public includes all debt held outside the federal government, held by private investors, whether domestic or foreign, by foreign and domestic state and local governments, and by the Federal Reserve System. Second, intra-government debt is that part of the debt held in accounts administered by the federal government, such as the Social Security Trust Fund. Which measure of the debt is appropriate? While some economists, like Paul Krugman, argue that the publicly held debt is the best measure, many others, including me, argue that you have to look at the gross debt, which includes the debt the government owes itself. Why? Well, consider Social Security. As Social Security moves from running a surplus to a deficit, it will begin to redeem the securities held in that Social Security Trust Fund. How will the Treasury pay to redeem those bonds? It will sell more bonds. And as that happens, intragovernmental debt will be replaced by publicly held debt. So the gross debt is clearly the relevant figure. At the end of 2010, the debt held by the public was, in nominal or undeflated terms, $9.023 trillion, while the gross debt was $13.562 trillion. 10 years earlier, in 2000, the numbers were $3.41 trillion and $5.674 trillion. In 1960, the numbers were $237 billion and $286 billion. We correct almost all economic measures that are reported in nominal terms, including gross domestic product, for the effects of inflation. Just as rising prices reduce the value of incomes and wealth in real terms, it does the same for the national debt. As the price level rises, interest and principal are repaid with dollars that are worth less and less money. If the price level rises faster than the national debt is increasing, which is not the case at present, then the real value of the national debt actually decreases. So one way to get out from under the burdens of the debt is by inflation. But inflation is simply a tax on anybody who holds their wealth in nominal terms, in checking accounts, savings accounts, treasury bills, or money. Since the next adjustment for thinking about the size of the debt automatically corrects for the effects of inflation, I'm not going to say anything more about the problem of correcting for inflation. Some people in this country own houses worth millions of dollars and face what, from my viewpoint, would be astronomically large monthly payments. But payments that would bankrupt me would be no problem for Bill Gates. So to figure out whether any particular level of the national debt is in some sense a problem, we have to know something about the ability of the government to pay interest on the debt. The government has a clear advantage over even Bill Gates in that regard because the government has the power to raise taxes, something that Gates can't do. The traditional way to correct the absolute size of the debt for the nation's ability to handle the debt is to look at the ratio of the debt to gross domestic product, which measures the value of all the final goods and services produced in the economy during a particular period of time. If we use nominal GDP in this calculation, then we've taken care of the inflation problem because both the numerator and the denominator are expressed in nominal terms and the price level will cancel out. So while the absolute size of the nominal debt is itself an awe-inspiring number, most discussions of the national debt are cast in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. The debt to GDP ratio goes up only if the debt is going up faster than the overall economy is growing. If GDP grows faster than the debt, then the debt to GDP ratio actually goes down, even if the absolute size of the debt happens to be getting bigger. Now, historically, the debt to GDP ratio has increased during wartime periods. It did so during the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. It did so during the Revolutionary War, but that was before the Constitution was adopted. But the debt that the country had when the Constitution was adopted was largely those borrowings that were left over from the Revolutionary War. The first exception to that general pattern of debt going up during wartime years occurred during the mid-1970s. The debt to GDP ratio for the United States peaked at over 120% after the end of World War II, and it declined to 32% in 1974. At that point, it began an upward creep, growing to 66% in 1976. It dipped briefly in 2001 to 56% before it started growing again. It was 70% in 2008. In 2011, it was 102%. How does the U.S. debt to GDP ratio compare to that of other countries? OECD data for 2008 show that for industrialized countries, Japan led the pack with 173%. Greece was then at 100.8%. The U.S. was at 73.2%. The U.K. was at 58.7%. Australia was at 14.2%. So while the U.S. was not at the top of the list, there were lots of countries with lower ratios, some with significantly lower ratios. Is there some critical level of the U.S. debt to GDP ratio beyond which it is dangerous to go? Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt testified before Congress in 2010 that they found in a study of both advanced countries and emerging markets that a ratio above 90% was associated with significantly lower growth outcomes. So countries with debt to GDP ratios above 90% tended to grow more slowly than countries with lower debt to GDP ratios. While there may not be any magic debt to GDP ratio beyond which much more serious consequences begin to accrue, the rate at which the debt has grown, by $1.5 trillion a year while the economy has scarcely grown, must raise alarms even for those who believe that the current ratio is not an issue, because at that rate it can quickly get to a point where it has become an issue. And there are those who point out that as bad as the current situation may look, the reality is even worse. For example, the U.S. government has essentially nationalized the government-sponsored enterprises known as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The obligations of these two entities at the time they went into conservatorship, mainly mortgage debt guarantees, is estimated at $5 trillion, though how much the U.S. Treasury might have to cover is unclear, although the news just this week said they need another $700 billion to keep afloat, which simply adds to those obligations. In 2008, the United States government also guaranteed large amounts of obligations for mutual funds, banks, and corporations. The federal government is also potentially on the hook for trillions of dollars of payments under the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, an independent government agency created under ERISA that essentially takes over pension benefits for retirees when private plans fail. There are also unfunded government liabilities arising from Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. The present value of these future unfunded obligations is estimated at $45 trillion or more. That's in addition to the stated national debt that we have today. Deficits and debt, the economic effects. In order to judge whether or not the current size of the deficit and the debt pose significant problems for our economy, we need to explore the effects of the deficits and the debt. To begin with, consider the effects of a deficit on a closed economy, one that has no interaction with the rest of the world. If the economy is at full employment, if real output can't go up, then for the government spending to increase, something else has to go down. If the spending is financed by higher taxes on personal income, then consumption spending goes down dollar for dollar as government spending goes up. If instead the increased spending is financed by increased borrowing, then the increased demand for loans by the government will cause interest rates to go up. The higher interest rates will reduce private investment spending. Some of that may take the form of reduced consumer spending on durables like cars and appliances. Most of it is going to take the form of reduced investment spending. That's the phenomenon that economists have called crowding out. Government borrowing crowds out private investment spending. Again, private spending goes down dollar for dollar with the increased government spending. And so given the level of output, we just have to have, if government spending is going to go up, something has to go down on the other side of the equation. The problem with the crowding out effect is that it's very hard to find any evidence of this effect in the economic data. It's one of the most widely accepted doctrines in macroeconomics. You'll find it in any macroeconomic textbook. But if you go looking for the data that shows that higher interest rates are associated with lower investment spending, you will be hard-pressed to find it. Consider right now. The problem now is the government's borrowing $1.5 trillion a year and interest rates are extremely low. Partly that's due to monetary policy, partly it's the state of the economy, but it's certainly not consistent with the idea of crowding out. One possible explanation for the lack of evidence was actually offered by David Ricardo, an economist of the early 1800s, and it was resurrected by Harvard economist Robert Barrow in the 1980s under the title of the Ricardian equivalence principle. I've already emphasized that borrowing to finance spending is nothing more than taxes deferred into the future. Assume that the government wants to spend $100 billion today. It could raise taxes by $100 billion today, which would reduce consumption spending by the same amount, or it could sell $100 billion worth of one-year Treasury bills and then raise the taxes a year from now to pay off those Treasury bills. Ricardo argued that rational people will recognize that their tax bill is going to go up $100 billion in 1 year and will take action today to plan for it. They'll increase their saving today enough to pay the higher tax bill 1 year in the future. But higher savings means lower consumption spending. So it's actually consumption that gets crowded out in this theory as opposed to investment spending. Of course, the further into the future the bonds are going to get paid off, the more likely some people today will escape future taxes by simply being dead before the bonds mature. But if parents care about the well-being of their children and grandchildren, and the fact that many people leave bequests for their children and grandchildren suggests they do, then the effect may be preserved at least to some extent, because parents who are alive when the government's borrowing will know that their kids and grandkids are going to have to pay higher taxes, and they'll save more to give them more money so they can pay the higher. That's called super rationality. It's a bit controversial, but at least in theory it might be there. A more likely explanation for the lack of evidence in favor of the traditional view of crowding out lies in the recognizing that the United States is not a closed economy, it's an open economy. We import goods and services from the rest of the world, we export goods and services to the rest of the world, and we borrow and lend with the rest of the world. In an open economy, the analysis becomes a tiny bit more complicated, but a lot more realistic. In a closed economy, personal saving by households has to finance both government borrowing and private borrowing, because there's no other place for the borrowing to be financed. So increases in government borrowing obviously mean lower investment if that Ricardian equivalence principle doesn't work. But in an open economy, there is another source of saving that can be tapped. We can tap the rest of the world's saving. A budget deficit will tend to cause interest rates to go up, but in a world of highly mobile capital, and surely we live in that world, higher interest rates will immediately attract funds from the rest of the world that will flow into the economy. But in order to invest in the US economy, people need dollars, and so the demand for dollars in the foreign exchange markets go up. That causes the US dollar to appreciate, to become more valuable relative to foreign currencies. But when the dollar gets stronger against foreign currencies, guess what? Imports look cheaper, our exports look more expensive, our imports go up, our exports go down, and net exports, the difference between imports and exports, decreases significantly. In other words, we have a balance of trade deficit. So instead of investment spending getting crowded out in an open economy, it's net exports that decline in order to allow room for government spending to increase. This is the twin deficits problem, the conjunction of a government budget deficit with a balance of trade deficit. It's not a coincidence. It, in fact, is a cause and effect at work. The analysis offers a fundamentally important insight. The United States balance of trade deficit, which a lot of people think is way too big, cannot be solved by implementing measures to restrict imports or boost exports. Negative net exports, the balance of trade deficit, is equivalent to a net capital inflow from the rest of the world to the US economy. Foreign saving is supplementing domestic saving to finance domestic investment in the US government budget deficit. The calculus is straightforward and unforgiving. If you want to lower the current balance of trade deficit, we import a whole lot more than we export, then one of three things has to happen. First, private saving has to go up. That means the consumption has to go up. has to go down. And since the more affluent do most of the saving in our economy, implementing that change will involve policies that are usually dismissed as helping the rich at the expense of the poor, like changing the tax system from one based on taxing income to one based on taxing consumption, by exempting savings from taxation in the income tax, or by adopting a national sales tax, or by adopting a value-added tax, which is just another form of a sales tax. Second, investment has to go down. But investment is a key determinant of future economic growth and future increases in labor productivity and the standard of living. And future generations will be unable to support themselves as well as us as current retirees without an increase in output per capita. Or finally, the government budget deficit has to go down by some combination of higher taxes or lower spending. The government's budget is often described by economists as public saving, and reducing the budget deficit increases national saving by increasing public saving. So to get rid of that balance of trade deficit, tariffs on imports aren't going to solve the problem. You either have to increase private saving, increase public saving, reduce the deficit, or you have to cut investment spending. None of those are easy things to do. They all have opportunity costs. It's sometimes asserted that deficit spending involves mortgaging America's future, or shifting the burden of spending to future generations. Those platitudes represent sloppy thinking at best. The true opportunity cost of increased government spending is the things the private sector cannot do with the same resources being used by the government, whether it be building factories or houses, building cars or computers, or taking vacations. That cost is independent of how the government chooses to finance that spending. America financed World War II in part by selling bonds as opposed to raising taxes. But the steel and copper and glass and rubber and person power used by the government to fight the war were resources that could not be used to make civilian goods at the same time. That opportunity cost was borne by the people who were alive during the war. Higher taxes would have caused some people to bear more of that cost. Instead, the people who bought the war bonds bore most of the cost because they postponed the ability to spend those funds into the future to let the government spend those funds. So the true opportunity cost of government spending is borne by the people who are alive when the spending takes place. It really cannot be postponed into the future. It's sometimes said that the national debt is simply a wash because it is money that we owe ourselves. That is literally true in a closed economy. And so we return to my earlier point. What matters is not how the government chooses to finance its spending. What matters is what the government chooses to spend its money on. If you think the government is spending its money wisely, then don't worry, be happy. If you think the government is wasting your money, then write angry letters to your senators and congressmen and to the president, and when the next election rolls around, vote the rascals out. However, in an open economy, we don't just owe the debt to ourselves, we owe it to foreigners as well. In January 2011, foreigners owned $4.45 trillion of U.S. debt, or approximately 47% of the debt held by the public, $9.49 trillion, and 32% of the total debt, $14.1 trillion. The largest holders were the central banks of China, Japan, the United Kingdom, and Brazil. The share held by foreign governments has grown over time, rising from 13% of the public debt in 1988 to 25% in 2007 and 47% in 2011. As of May 9, 2011, the largest single holder of U.S. government debt was China, with 36% of all foreign-held U.S. Treasury securities and 16% of total U.S. public debt. Doesn't the fact that foreigners own a significant share of our national debt mean that at least that part of the debt represents a burden on future generations? Nope. The fact that foreign countries financed a sizable fraction of our budget deficits means that we had more resources available for other purposes than we otherwise would have. If those resources made available were used in ways that make the economy more productive, building schools and infrastructure, for example, then future generations will be richer and better able to pay interest and principal on the debt owed to foreigners. If the funds were wasted by having lots of parties, for example, then we are back to square one. You should care about what the government is doing with the money it spends, not with whether the money came from taxes or borrowing, regardless of from whom it was borrowed, whether domestic borrowers, lenders, or foreign lenders. I've deliberately avoided the question of whether deficit spending can be used to stimulate the economy out of a recession. That topic deserves a paper or a book of its own. I'll simply say that you should not try to balance the budget during a recession. You should do that during periods of strong economic growth. Right now, the economy is not in a recession, but neither is it growing strongly, so we need to start getting the budget deficit under control, but we shouldn't try to balance it next year. Visions of the future. In the October 23, 2011 New York Times, Greg Mankiw, Harvard economist, former chair of President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, and author of the textbooks I use to teach macroeconomics here at CMU, a self-described new Keynesian, offered 4 lessons for America to learn from in trying to decide what economic policies to follow for the immediate future. He described them as the 4 horsemen of the economic apocalypse. The first is Zimbabwe, which Mankiw says deserves the prize for world's worst economic policy. Zimbabwe chose to pay for its expenses not by taxing or selling bonds, but by printing money. It generated a spectacular hyperinflation, eventually printing a $100 trillion notes for people to use. John Taylor of Stanford University has written that no self-respecting monetary economist goes around without a $100 trillion note, and I claim to be a monetary economist, and there is my $100 trillion note. I have a $50 trillion, a $20 trillion, and a $10 trillion note if you're interested. I also have a 20 million mark note from the German hyperinflation during the Weimar Republic. And of course, the Confederate States relied a lot more on printing money, and the North counterfeited the South's Confederate money to make that inflation worse. There's a $20 Confederate States of America note that contributed to their pretty drastic inflation. The hyperinflation in Zimbabwe ended only when the people of Zimbabwe said that enough is enough and stopped using their own currency. They started using the US dollar as their currency. What is impressive is how fast the hyperinflation can end when the government stops printing money or the people start using a different money. An independent central bank would seem to insulate the US from that kind of hyperinflation experienced by Zimbabwe, but inflation is nonetheless a relevant concern. Politicians have begun talking about changing the structure of the Fed in ways that would make it less independent and more subject to political persuasion. The Fed itself, in battling the last recession and financial crisis, has caused a huge increase in what we call the monetary base, which could fuel rapid inflation if the Fed is not careful. With a huge slack in the economy and low interest rates, the Fed seems unconcerned about the prospects for future inflation. But if the growing national debt causes our creditors to become concerned about our ability to repay principal and interest, and of course Standard & Poor's downgraded U.S. debt a notch because of its concerns about the budget process in this country, then the interest rate we have to pay on the debt will begin to grow, and the Fed will face pressure to keep interest rates from rising, and to do that it will be forced to monetize the debt, causing inflation. The chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, Ben Bernanke, seems more concerned about the U.S. becoming the next Japan rather than the next Zimbabwe. In the 1980s, Japan was what China has become today, the economy that everybody was afraid of. But the bursting real estate and stock market bubbles in the early 1990s in Japan put an end to such concerns. Bernanke believes that the Japanese central bank was too concerned with inflation and not concerned enough with recession and slow growth, and it delivered a monetary policy that condemned that economy to little or no growth. Japan's policy options were hobbled to some extent by its very high ratio of national debt to GDP, which is exactly where we are today. The third lesson comes from Greece. 4 years ago, the financial markets were quite willing to loan more money to the Greek government at reasonable rates of interest. But financial markets can be fickle, and their unwillingness to make additional loans has forced up interest rates and thus the cost of debt service, creating the crisis we observe today. The key question is whether Greece is willing to make the sacrifices that are being demanded as the price of remaining a part of the Eurozone. If it rejects the latest bailout offer, it seems like it's going to accept it. Default on Greek bonds is a near certainty, and Greece will be forced to abandon the euro, and that will cause Italy or perhaps Spain to default, and things will go downhill from there. And if Greece abandons the euro, it will have its own independent monetary policy once again, and it could use inflation as a way out of its current problems. So far, financial markets seem willing to continue to lend to the U.S. economy at very low interest rates. After all, we always pay our bills on time. But few economists believe that will continue for the foreseeable future. The message would seem to be that we still have some time, but it is critical that we finally make some tough decisions about how we are going to get the federal budget under control. That will require some combination of tax increases and spending cuts, and the devil, as they say, is in the details. If you were present at Fred Bergsten's talk the Friday before homecoming this year, then you heard his opinion of the results of the latest attempt to come to a solution to the budget problem. Congress and the President did nothing at all to solve the problem. It was all just more smoke and mirrors, and they punted the problem to this bipartisan super committee that's charged with coming up with a real solution to the problem. If they fail, then automatic spending cuts are scheduled to go into effect. But politicians of both parties have already described those automatic cuts as unacceptable, and recent headlines suggest that the super committee is nowhere near close to coming to an agreement about how to solve the problem. So deadlock may be the case, and that will simply accelerate the time when we're going to be headed for a crisis in terms of getting our own house in order. The fourth lesson Mankiw offers comes from France, whose per capita GDP is 29% less than that of the US. Most of the difference is because the French work so many fewer hours over their lifetimes than we do in this country. Americans are often advised to be more like the French, to take more time off, to enjoy the good things in life. We are often told that Europeans are sociologically different from us. For example, in most of Europe, people drive smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, proving that they are more concerned about the environment than we are in this country. The Economist, however, suggests that the difference is better explained by the fact that gasoline is much more expensive in Europe than it is in the US because of higher excise taxes, and that many European countries impose high taxes on large cars to get poor gas mileage. Perhaps Americans would act more like Europeans if they faced the same incentives. Do the French work less because they have different preferences about work and leisure? Or do they work less because they face much higher tax rates than we do in the US? In 2009, taxes were 24% of GDP in the US and 42% of GDP in France. While France has lowered its top marginal tax rate since 1979 to the present, the average worker in France, not the most affluent workers, the average worker in France faces a 40% marginal tax rate, while high-income workers face a 50% marginal tax rate, on top of the value-added tax that the French have. By contrast, the tax rate on average workers in neighboring Switzerland is 20%. So where do we stand on this question of what to do about the deficit and the debt? While I've not worried much about the size of US budget deficits in the years since I was a deficit hawk in the 1980s, the deficits we have seen in the last few years, in the range of $1.5 trillion a year, are simply unsustainable in the long run. And I believe it would be a serious error to believe that we can continue on with the current pattern for even a few more years. That's what Greece thought, and things changed very quickly. If financial markets begin to suspect a fundamental problem that our politicians cannot or will not solve, interest rates will begin to rise dramatically, and if our foreign creditors begin to sell off our debt, the US dollar will begin a steep drop that will disrupt international trade and capital flows. My own conclusion is that America must make some tough decisions about the budget deficit in the next few years, which means that the next presidential election will be one that is more important than any we have seen in the recent past. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers. If you believe that our social safety net must be preserved at its current level, or even expanded, then taxes will have to be increased to European levels and as Social Security and Medicare costs begin to rise. If you believe that much government spending is currently either wasted or even counterproductive, then you will favor budget cuts more than tax increases. While it is not a popular notion, most economists recognize that there is a fundamental trade-off between equality on the one hand and efficiency on the other. On page 5 of his brief Principles of Macroeconomics textbook, Greg Mankiw writes, "Another trade-off society faces is between efficiency and equality. Efficiency means that society is getting the maximum benefits from its scarce resources. Equality means that those benefits are distributed uniformly among society's members. In other words, efficiency refers to the size of the economic pie, and equality refers to how the pie is cut up into individual slices." A fundamental rule of economics is that when you tax anything, you get less of it, and when you subsidize anything, you get more of it. Trying to improve equality involves increasing taxes on the affluent and increasing subsidies to the poor. And those policies reduce the size of the economic pie. That's the French model. By discouraging work effort at both ends of the income distribution. In the name of more equal slices of the pie itself keeps getting smaller and smaller. Let me close with a few recommendations. First, America must tackle entitlements. Social Security and Medicare reform. Social Security reform is probably the easier of the two, but at a minimum we have to end the incentives that exist for people to retire early. The age for receiving Social Security benefits has to be gradually raised, and benefits for the wealthy will probably have to be means tested. We should give serious consideration to the possibility of privatizing at least some portion of Social Security for younger Americans. Obamacare has, I hope, finally been exposed as unsustainable, since a key program that was supposed to help pay for the program has now been dropped, and since no one can possibly believe that the promised cuts to Medicare will actually be implemented by our Congress. It needs to be scrapped and a new approach to health care adopted that is based on eliminating the incentives that currently exist for excessive spending on health care. Health insurance has to be separated from employment, and a truly national market for health insurance has to be created. I don't favor a balanced budget amendment, but I would support a constitutional cap on the government share of GDP at 20%. I believe we should adopt some kind of institutional hurdle for any new laws that either spend money or add to the regulatory burden. In order to be passed, an independent group must certify that the spending program or the regulations clearly have total benefits that exceed their total costs. Programs that greatly benefit a few people by imposing small costs on millions of other people have to be ended. Corporate welfare, agricultural price supports, and the like. The Federal Department of Education should be closed and all responsibility for education returned to the states and localities where it belongs. We should immediately stop fighting wars on foreign soils that actually make this country less rather than more safe, in my opinion. We should stop spending our money on defending the rest of the world and let them spend their own money on defending themselves. We need a bipartisan commission to carefully examine the regulatory structure in this country. The Obama administration has implemented fewer regulations than its predecessor, but many seem to be extremely costly in terms of discouraging business from creating jobs. We need to make it much easier for people from other countries with valuable skills to immigrate to this country, and a change that will also help with our Social Security problem. The tax issue seems to be the thorniest one of all. It is the one that has bogged down the Deficit Reduction Supercommittee. The first point I would make is that we cannot afford to make changes in the tax laws simply on the basis that they would be fairer. For example, there's ample evidence that significantly higher tax rates on the affluent will not succeed in raising more tax revenues. Believe it or not, the infamous Laffer curve really does work. It is possible to raise tax rates high enough to discourage productive activity and encourage tax avoidance activity. Raising taxes on the rich in the name of fairness and ending up with lower tax revenues is something we simply cannot afford to do. In my opinion, what we need is another round of tax reform, but instead of being revenue neutral, let's make it revenue enhancing. If Warren Buffett pays a lower average tax rate than his secretary, then eliminate the tax deductions that help him do that. His marginal tax rate will not rise, but his taxable income will go up, and so he will pay more taxes. By eliminating most or all tax deductions and tax credits, the tax system can generate significantly more revenues, and we might even be able to lower marginal tax rates a bit and still come out ahead. Most commentators now recognize that it is simply impossible to balance the budget on the backs of the rich. The rich simply do not earn enough money, even if tax rates were raised to punitively high levels. So the other end of the income distribution will have to pay something more, or at least something. 51% of Americans pay no income tax at all. We've taken a huge proportion of our population completely off the income tax rolls, and in doing so we have created a huge constituency that will vote in favor of any spending program that offers them any benefits at all, because it will cost them literally nothing because they don't pay any taxes. I believe that the tax code has to be changed so that every productive member of society pays at least something toward the cost of running our government. Finally, let me note that economic growth can help eliminate the deficit problem. because as the economy grows in real terms, tax revenues increase and spending on social programs goes down. Any changes in regulations and taxes must be scrutinized in terms of their effects on the prospects for economic growth. The standard of living for our children and grandchildren will be determined by only one variable, and it's not the power of labor unions or the level of the minimum wage, it's labor productivity. How much each worker produces per day or per hour. GDP per capita cannot grow over time, and GDP per capita is our best measure of standard of living, unless labor productivity grows over time. And labor productivity can't grow over time unless we get the incentives right. Incentives to stay in school, incentives to learn a skill, incentives to find ways to work more efficiently, incentives to save and invest rather than borrow and spend. I consider myself an optimist when it comes to this nation's economic future, mainly because I'm an economic historian. And in learning American economic history, I learned that as a nation we were different, literally different than other countries of the world. The people who settled this country, whether voluntarily or by force, were different. They were harder working, they were stronger, they were willing to take more risks. They believed that a willingness to work hard and to take appropriate risks would allow a person to succeed beyond the wildest dreams of their parents or grandparents. I believe that America's economic future at this point depends critically on our continued willingness to be different, to reject economic models that promise only stagnation and decay. In the next few years, this country will be forced to make those kinds of tough decisions, and I hope that this paper may help people understand at least a little bit better the choices that we face. Thank you very much.